So the story of cholera is a great example of a pathogen that emerges from the environment and then spreads through human populations thanks to social and economic factors. Cholera's original home was most likely around the Sundarbans, which is the wetlands around the Bay of Bengal. But it normally lives quite peacefully in the marine environment. They help to recycle nutrients. They live in conjunction with zooplankton. So the British decided to cut down the Sundarbans and transform those wetlands into rice paddies. And so quite suddenly, this area that had been impenetrable to humans was cut down and settled. So people started to have a lot more contact with this brackish water that was full of cholera bacteria.
The movement of cholera out of the Sundarbans was specifically for timber, not just for fuel, for locomotion, for steam engines, but also specifically for shipbuilding, so the increase of the size of the British Navy for further conquest throughout the world.
And then people started to carry it up into the old world through the bodies of soldiers and traders and travelers into Russia and then over into Europe. This was the era of industrialization, so all these new cities were growing really by leaps and bounds. So cholera emerged at the exact right moment to create a pandemic. If it had happened any earlier, cholera would have been carried by foot from Bangladesh into Russia and into Europe, but it wouldn't be able to make it across the Atlantic. We had changed all that thanks to the steam engine, essentially.
The massive dehydration that cholera causes was perceived by scientists of the day to darken the skin of the body, to shrivel and render thinner and more starved looking. The disease was described as rendering blood the consistency and texture and color of India ink, a commodity that was harvested and traded as one of the drivers of imperial economics.
So when cholera bacteria was able to get into these extremely crowded places where people were being exposed to each other all the time, people were being exposed to each other's waste all the time, it was just able to spark these massive epidemics. And this happened again and again over the course of the better part of a century. So as soon as the first outbreaks of cholera happened in the old world, people were able to get on packet ships and steamships and get across the Atlantic and seed new epidemics in Canada. And then from Canada, cholera moved down the Erie Canal, hit New York City again and again and again. This new kind of cholera that was killing people really quickly, well, that was something different. That was considered the Asiatic cholera. And Asia was always considered a very othered place, a very strange and exotic place that didn't have anything to do with us, even though we had constant circulation of people from Asia into North America, into Europe, and back and forth again. But I think there's also this psychological dynamic of othering the microbe, othering the disease, othering this problem, to kind of distance ourselves from it. One of the hallmarks of a lot of outbreaks of new diseases is that they sow mistrust between people. You suddenly have this new thing that's making people sick. Some people are getting sick, some people aren't getting sick. Nobody knows why it's happening, how it spreads, why it's happening here and not there, why is it happening to me and not her. All these questions arrive, and in the absence of any real understanding of why that's happening, people start to blame each other. This is something that, if you go back in history, you see in a lot of outbreaks of new diseases that there's some form of scapegoating going on. And the scapegoat varies from period to period. So for cholera, for example, in the 1830s, it was the Irish immigrants who were blamed for the cholera, and alcoholics and the poor. In the 1840s, it was the Muslims that were blamed for the cholera. In the 1890s, it was the Eastern Europeans who were blamed for the cholera. You know, any marginalized group at that time who was making people kind of anxious, those are the people who would be blamed for this disease.
Because of the overlap of the cholera epidemic and the political uprising, the language of sickness was in the air. It became a really handy way to describe the way that the uprising or the First Indian War of Independence emerged at a lot of different places all at the same time. But the part of the reason that they couldn't wrap their head around uprisings happening all over the place is because there was no concept that Indian colonized subjects were political beings. Much of the writing in the 18th century and then leading into the early 19th century posited peasant uprisings and rebellions as being like thunderstorms, earthquakes, wildfires, and plagues.
It was also doctors who were scapegoated during the cholera years. Doctors were stoned. There was riots at cholera hospitals. Some of them were burnt down. Angry mobs would come together.
We tend to think of politics and medicine, or we did tend to think of politics and medicine until COVID-19 as being pretty separate phenomena. But in this instance, we're really talking about an incursion of East India Company troops that begins in the early 19th century and starts to create ecological and political catastrophes. So the connection between those two things didn't seem apparent to early contagionists, but it looks quite apparent to us now. That disrupting an existing ecosystem, both a literal ecosystem and a political ecosystem, led to both rebellion and the spread of disease beyond where it was endemic or where it originated.
Bubonic plague was raging in southern China. It was hitting ports in like Bombay and Cape Town. It was a devastating pandemic, and it was one that already carried and freighted all kinds of fears because people invoked and knew about the stories of the Black Plague of the 14th century. When plague was happening yet again in the late 1890s, there was an anticipation from a widely expanded public health service that it was going to eventually arrive in the United States, and it was likely to arrive through a conduit of Chinese people and into a Chinatown. They, in fact, were doing surveillance of every Chinese district. They were doing surveillance of every ship leaving Shanghai and Yokohama to really ferret out that first case. And when they did in Honolulu, and they found in a district that was 10,000 people strong, that was called a Chinatown, but also a place where Japanese residents, Native Hawaiians lived. When they located a death that they suspected was bubonic plague, they began to do these quarantines of the entire district. And these controlled fires and burns that just turned into an incredible conflagration and burned the entire district down, left 8,000 people homeless, and also ensured that many rats escaped. And as we now know, rats and rat fleas are the purveyor of bubonic plague to humans. And that source of transmission continued. The idea was that race and place were going to be the central node by which bubonic plague was going to emerge. It had already been decided. It was already anticipated. When bubonic plague is suspected in March of 1900, when a man is found dead in the Globe Hotel in San Francisco's Chinatown, there's a very quick movement afoot to take his body and take specimens from his body to have them tested. And even before the testing can actually reveal whether he had bubonic plague or died of something else, 32 police officers are sent to sort of create this cordon sanitaire around Chinatown. They actually decided to seal off the whole district and to keep it sealed and to not let anyone who is Chinese leave. They discover over time that eradicating rats is actually the best method. And they only diagnose people who are Chinese or Japanese with bubonic plague, i.e. they only do the testing on them. But after the Great Earthquake and Fire of 1906, when Chinatown is leveled, along with the rest of downtown San Francisco, bubonic plague is rampant all over the Bay Area. And in fact, very few people who are Chinese ever are diagnosed with it. In fact, mostly everyone else is, because it was really the rat fleas that were transmitting the disease.
The plague bacterium had been identified, but that is not really significant in this story. What is significant is the belief that plague is a disease that infects houses, that infects items, a disease or an infection of locality. In Hong Kong, that was the first big epidemic to be encountered by British colonial authorities. So a large part of the operations led by the Whitewash Brigade was to evacuate houses, which were believed to be infected, and burn items in order to, as it were, disinfect Hong Kong or to stamp out plague. So Hong Kong, 1894, is the first epidemic to be systematically photographed. When in Hong Kong we have just a few of these, when the plague arrives in India and in other parts of the world, we have a true explosion. We have thousands of photographs taken by journalists, by missionaries, by people on the ground, by colonial officers, of course, by doctors. So newspapers started producing these photographs of outbreaks across the globe, and it became very quickly kind of a global spectacle. The real focus of the British colonial visualization of this invention was the industrial scale, or the industrial capacity and efficacy of the empire. The British and the Haffkine Institute focused on the industry of its vaccine. What makes this a different genre of photography altogether is that it's not interested in the patient, it's not interested in the symptoms of the disease, it is interested in the causes of the disease, in the conditions that allow the disease to become endemic or pandemic or epidemic. It is interested in recording measures for controlling the disease, such as disinfection or deratization or burning villages and towns. Of course, these very intrusive measures led to a lot of resistance, a lot of reaction, and sometimes very, very violent riots, and even a very famous assassination of a plague commissioner in Pune. What the third plague pandemic did was to create, as it were, an optical unconscious, to use Walter Benjamin's terms, with regards to epidemic. If you want, a visual language, which we are not even aware of anymore. It has become so part of the way in which we think and the way we look at things and the way we visualize and imagine epidemics that we're not even conscious of it. It's a very worrying phenomenon because it indicates the extent to which we still think in colonial ways.
If you were to look at history and you were to put it on a timeline and look at all the pinpoints on the timeline, most of those pinpoints are violence. You know, we benchmark change through wars, through riots or rebellions, and they are turning points that come about through violence.
The influenza pandemic, we were at war, and that completely changed the spin that was put on things.
We are returning from war. The crisis and tens of thousands of Black men were drafted into a great struggle for bleeding France and what she means and has meant and will mean to us and humanity, and against the threat of German race arrogance. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we'll save it in the United States of America. Or know the reason why.
In 1918, we had the largest outbreak in memory, which was in the 1918 pandemic, and that was termed Spanish flu by some people. And so again, it created a false image of where it started from, and you know, it did not start in Spain. The last influenza pandemic started in North America. We had both elderly people who were at high risk of dying, but also very unusually young and healthy people between 20 and 40. And so that was a consequence of that particular virus emerging at that point in time.
The worst part was that fall wave that nobody was prepared for.
When you think about the early 20th century and you think about the Great Migration, a wave of millions of African Americans who are moving from the South to the North, and they're moving to cities like Philadelphia and Chicago and New York and Detroit, police forces get even more bolstered because they're responding to the increased population of Black people within their cities. Police to protect what? To protect white people, to protect white assets, to protect white businesses, to protect white homes. And all of this keeps people from having, one, real integration, but also it still perpetuates the myth that whenever you see a Black person, they're up to no good. They're going to cause you harm. If a Black person is in your presence, it should only be for their servitude.
The Red Summer was the year 1919, and it's metaphorically summer because I think that the massacres stretched beyond the summer months. But it was a year in which upwards of 40 massacres took place where white terrorists attacked black communities, as they had in another 60 of these that took place from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the 1940s. They murdered black people, and they either destroyed or appropriated their property. And if they destroyed property, they eventually frequently appropriated the real estate where the property had stood anyway. Essentially, the Red Summer was another phase of violent redistribution of wealth on the part of whites towards blacks.
If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead.
We have a very complicated and I think hypocritical relationship with violence. That's how you get this myth of white people commit crimes, but black people are criminals. It doesn't matter what you do. Criminality is tethered to your identity.
On a societal level, we can see that outbreaks create or exacerbate and worsen what are, in essence, lines of inequities.
So we should be thinking about outbreaks as somehow metaphorically reminding us of the social disorder that we need to address. And let's begin with the way of inhabiting the planet that was coterminous with and fueled by racial colonialism and settler colonialism.
It's like the butterfly effect, the collapse of small creatures in small environments that you think have nothing to do with you really are canaries in the mine that indicate much larger problems.